This slideshow expands and extends the last unit. When we're thinking about strategies to gather data for alternative assessments, we need to think about, how is this going to be seamlessly integrated into pedagogy. So our approaches will be different than they will be in traditional testing. First of all, I think it's important to note that the arts have really been on the vanguard of using authentic tasks. So the initial writing, which occurred in the late 80s about developing portfolios or developing authentic strategies, was really led by people who were researching arts issues. In fact, one of the key projects was a project that was done by Harvard Project Zero in the Pittsburgh Public Schools called Arts Propel. And so clearly it is the arts that are in the forefront of this approach to testing. And that may make sense, since the arts have always been interested in kind of the need to evaluate complex behaviors. If you had to point to one art, you could argue, I think, clearly the visual arts, who have always used a portfolio approach, particularly in educational transition times, like applying to college. The name even comes from, in a sense, their experiences. Music teachers, in order to use a performance task as a means of achieving assessment, that they've been doing that for a while. Are there ways that we can better incorporate authentic tasks and more fully reconceptualize assessment? Yeah, I think there are, and so we'll explore those in this unit. One of the questions we need to ask ourselves is what kind of success should we look for? What are the outcomes we should look for in a music class? It's more than just playing or singing well. I think you can make the case that a musically literate student should be able to play, listen critically, improvise, compose, all of the skills and understandings that are part of being of a comprehensive education in music. In a sense, the national standards, which list those 9 different skill areas, understanding areas, are the kinds of expectations we expect a child to be able to do after a good 12 years of musical education. What is the kind of evidence that music educators seek to understand whether their students have all these skills? How do we gather that evidence is what's going to be addressed here. Certainly portfolios are an approach that is kind of intertwined with this idea of authentic assessment or alternative assessment. And portfolios are really folders, gathering places where we keep evidence of students' work, where we can keep track of student learning, where we can help students revise and improve their work. Portfolios like this are typically called process portfolios. In a sense, they're tied to the notion of formative evaluation, the idea of giving students feedback as they learn, as they reach small steps towards working towards a particular goal. Portfolios that are more cumulative and represent kind of culminating work at the end of a period, at the end of a semester, at the end of a year, are called product portfolios. And those are more tied to summative evaluation, which show how far a student has achieved, again, during a typical time period. Process portfolios are places where students keep evidence of their achievement and growth over time. So they might include performances as well as evidence of the student's perception in music and reflection on music. Production, perception, and reflection are key components of this Arts Propel project, their approach to assessment, which is described more fully in a book by Wolf and Pistone in 1991. published in 1991. They advocate this multiple approach where production, which is typically realized in a composition or performance, is accompanied by the ability to carefully discriminate. We could argue that in order for students to refine their performances, they need to be able to discriminate and, of course, self-assess. And reflection is also a skill that's necessary for musicians, because they need to be able to evaluate their strengths and weaknesses. The notion of being in a practice room, rather than playing a piece over and over again from beginning to end, being able to reflect on what areas do I need to work on, be able to first perceive those, and then to be able to reflect and say, okay, I need to work on this rhythm. I don't have that down yet. I think that might be an example of, being self-critical, being able to self-assess, being able to reflect. So in a music process portfolio, what evidence might there be? One thing certainly could be audio tapes of student performances throughout the year, which demonstrate the development of skills over time. Just remember, portfolios provide evidence not only for the student, but also for parents, and also for administrators and other teachers. So just think how informative audio tapes would be to the student, where we've recorded the student in September, and again in November, and again in February, and again in May. And so the student can really sense how they've progressed through the year. There also should be evidence of the student's ability to perceive and to reflect. Written reflections of rehearsals or tapes of rehearsals might be things that one would include. Evidence such as written or individual critiques, tapes of performances, concert reviews, questionnaires in students' portfolios, the ability of students to listen to live performances or tapes of themselves and ensembles and then comment on passages that need to be improvement, or that show improvement, that need to be improved or show improvement. Those would all be not evidence of performance, but evidence of perception and reflection. Here are some possible data sheets. These were developed, these examples come from a dissertation by Kevin Durth that focused on portfolio assessment. So these are primarily, the materials are primarily from high school students. Here's an example of a student commenting on a rehearsal. And it appears that they're focusing primarily on their own performance, although it might also be, one might develop a sheet where the student would comment not only on their own performance, but the performance of a group, or maybe the performance of their section. All the sheet really is simply a kind of blank tablet which reminds the student to comment on certain aspects. So in this particular example, we've asked the student, we're expecting comments in pitch, rhythm, tempo, dynamics, and articulation. And we can see this particular student commented on 3 of those 5 areas. And this might be something that would find its way into our portfolio as evidence of the student's ability to perceive and to reflect. The comment, overall, I think it sounded terrible and was very rusty. My 16th notes need to be cleared up quite a bit. This is pretty good thinking for a student. Hopefully then he or she has the mechanics to be able to change these aspects of the performance that he or she's perceived as being problematic. Here's another kind of data collection tool that would help the student in moving towards a more musical performance. The scenario here is that the student is listening to probably a recording of the work, maybe actually a live performance, and is taking a score and writing comments, circling sections and writing comments on them. It appears again that the student is focusing primarily on their own performance, saying both positive and negative things, reminding themselves about things they need to do in the performance. Probably this reflects comments by the ensemble director when they were working on the piece. And one thing one might look for is correct use of vocabulary, music vocabulary. So we could see, at least some musical terms in the fourth area that's circled. There's the use of the correct use of the term accents. Then in the last one, there's the correct use of the term eighth notes. So looking for musical terminology would be one way to think about the success of these kinds of data gathering tools. You notice in the first area circled the idea, the notion of imagery, which was probably something that the instructor introduced to communicate what that section should sound like. Writing, the inclusion of examples of writing, reflections on rehearsals, critiques of performances, serves to document students' musical thinking. In this example, a particular high school ensemble director has asked students to write reviews of their concerts. These assignments provide, again, evidence of students' perception and reflection. The student can focus attention on their own performances and adjust their performance as a consequence. Or the assignment might be focused more on ensemble, and the student can gather some notion about their understanding of the context for their own performances. That's an important goal in ensemble playing, to understand how you as a musician fit within the context of a group. Here's an example of a band member's critique of a concert. I believe it's a holiday concert, as you can look at some of the tunes that are commented on. If one was going to grade this, one would again likely use, you could of course choose to use language arts kinds of issues. Is the spelling correct? Is it well written? But from a musical perspective, maybe the most important component might be the precision of the comments, the use of musical terms. There's a fair amount of musical terms in this response. Of course, appropriately used, we trust. Another way of gathering evidence of in alternative assessment might be to use journals. Now, one question that might arise are several assignments gathered together in a notebook? Is that a journal? I'm not sure experts would agree. The question is, should journals have a narrower definition or a broader definition? In my experience, I found that journaling can be useful, particularly when there are relatively specific objectives in mind, so that I believe students need guidance rather than simply a blank page in front of them. So I think some of the examples we've seen earlier could belong in a portfolio as reflective pieces, they could also maybe be called a journal, and the journal would be composed of several different assignments. Journals might include students writing reflections of their work, their ideas for composing, their evaluations of performances, places where students can provide evidence of their thinking about music, maybe in a metacognitive way, means that they're reflecting on their own thinking. Here is an illustration of a high school student's lesson journal. You can see as you read it, the student is commenting in general about how the lesson went, but also rather specifically about some challenges that she has in playing the piece. Again, I think this reflects the kind of development of independent musicianship that we hope our students can develop, so when they're in the practice room, they don't need a teacher to help them improve their performance, but can analyze their own performance. Notice this student has a unique way of spelling rhythm. Finally, we might think about what are strategies that we could use for evaluating journals or portfolios. Journals certainly could be one approach to evaluating journals. Could be the notion of self-assessment. Another issue might be should be what should be included in a final portfolio. And the question which might be whether or not journals become more of diaries and are personal reflections that may or may not be part of the evaluation in let's say a process or some summative product-oriented portfolio. It may be that every item in a process portfolio might not be included in an evaluation of it. It might be that as one's developing a product portfolio, one that serves in a summative purpose, that the teacher and student might select items to be included in the portfolio to determine the grade. Although the teacher might have some guidelines that would say, okay, we all need to include at least one rehearsal critique or one review of a concert. Scoring rubrics would again be a reasonable or logical approach as an effective tool for evaluating evidence of students' portfolios. You might have a scoring rubric for different components in the portfolio. So again, one scoring rubric for an ensemble critique and another for a concert review, and another one maybe for the performances. Another approach would be to, in order to support student self-assessment, might be to have the student use a scoring rubric, the same scoring rubric, to evaluate some of the components in the portfolio, and then have the teacher evaluate the same components, and then have a conference with the student and compare evaluations. This would really help support students developing self-assessment skills. Where the student and the teacher disagree, could create conversations that would really enhance the students' learning in general and specifically their self-assessment tools. In this unit, there are going to be posted several illustrations of assignments that can be used to gather evidence for alternative assessment. So with this short presentation, you should look to the examples to get some ideas about how you might incorporate alternative assessment strategies into your own teaching. So this concludes this PowerPoint narrated presentation.